Well, good morning. My name is Zack Thompson, as was mentioned, and I am normally on our Thornton campus, but it is a joy to get to come to our other campuses. It's a delight for me personally. It comes with the reminders of how many people are praying for our campus who don't even attend that campus, and to be surrounded again by people who are as excited as I am about what God is doing in the city of Thornton. Now, I will confess that my love for being here was put to the test last year. And to be clear, that has nothing to do with any of you all. I was here it was the week after Father's Day, and I was given the task of preaching on God the Father. Perfect timing, right? Not so much. It was also the same week that we had our appointment with a fertility clinic. I should say the second fertility clinic that we had gone to in the 7 years of Emily and I trying to become parents. And at this appointment, we were told that we had a less than 1% chance of conceiving naturally and a less than 5% chance of an IUI ever working for us. And so it was an awful time. And I was here, I was smiling at dads, talking about God the Father, all while repeating almost like a mantra in my head, yeah, but you'll never be one. It was not a very good time. Well, anyways, here's a picture of our son, Everett. Now, I was hesitant to bring this up. For one, I don't like making myself the focus of attention. Like, yeah, the guy on stage in front of a couple hundred people doesn't like attention. But there's something different between what I'm up here to do, which is let's look at what the Bible says together, and hey, everyone, look at my life. But I was hesitant as well because there's still plenty of people who don't have a picture to put up. And we met lots of people over the 7 years of us trying to become parents who are still waiting for direction, who are still hoping or have given up hope. And I don't want to add anything on top of that. Now, I recognize it's so much easier to say on this side of things, but I do know what God was teaching me over those 7 years of waiting. And it was God is still a good and perfect Father, even if I never become one. But I do share this because there are so many of you who have been a support to us in this, that are praying for us, who have been alongside of us in the difficulty, and so you deserve to be included in the joy. But I bring it up as well because Everett's story is one that's coded all throughout by our topic this morning. That we're in the series that we are calling Formed, looking at these practices of Christianity that shape us, that form us to be more and more like Jesus. And today we're looking at two of these practices that are given to us for the times of waiting and for the times of rejoicing in this life. And those practices are fasting and feasting. Now, it sounds like the two very opposite practices, and yet they're interconnected in so many different ways. For one, many modern Christians have a misunderstanding about both. For many Christians, there is the neglect of fasting. It's just not part of our life. Now, I've been informed that there is a group of folks here on this campus that fast every single week. I think it's Tuesdays that you guys get together to fast, and that's fantastic. I still think there's a lot that we can learn together on this topic. But for most of us, though, if we're anything like the rest of the American church, it's a place of neglect for us. We see fasting as maybe for those super elite Christians or skinny people, but I just can't give up food. Then on the other side of that, there's the unspiritualness of feasting. Like there's a lot of times that we eat a lot, but apart from praying for the meal at the beginning of it, we don't really see how stuffing our face is a practice that makes us more and more like Jesus. But I think both of those come down to a misunderstanding. And it's actually a misunderstanding of how we're made. The Bible is clear that we are body and soul, flesh and spirit, not in opposition to each other, but as one person. And so what we have in this practice, more so than any other practice that we have in this series, as great as those are, what we have in this practice is a way to respond to God that gets to our whole person. See, we don't just respond to him with ethereal spirituality, but we respond to him with everything that we have, and that includes our bodies. And in fasting and feasting, we have two practices that are physical actions with spiritual intent that get to the formation of the whole person. And to get into this, I want to read for us our passage, which comes from Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 14. So we're in Matthew chapter 9. We're going to use this throughout the morning as we look at these two practices of fasting and feasting. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 14. It says, then the disciples of John, and this is John the Baptist, so the disciples of John the Baptist came to Jesus, saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins will burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, so both are preserved. So here we have this situation where these disciples of John come to Jesus and say, hey, how come all the other religious people are fasting except your people? Your people are instead marked by feasting. And as we get into this topic, it might be helpful for us to start by being on the same page of what are we talking about? So what are fasting and feasting really? What are these two practices? We'll start first with fasting. In Matthew chapter 9, he's asked about why aren't your disciples fasting? And Jesus says, I'm doing something new. I am here. The bridegroom is here. This is a time that's marked by celebration. Now there will be a day when I'm gone. When I'm away from my people, and then my people will fast. But I am bringing something new. There's no putting new wine in old wineskins. Something new is happening right now. And because that is the case, we don't go back to the Old Testament. We don't go back to the Old Testament practices or customs that are there. But Jesus says when he is gone, there will be a day that his people fast, just like God's people have always fasted. See, there are an insane amount of references to fasting all throughout the Bible. Essentially, it just is pick someone who's following God. There's probably a story of them fasting somewhere in there. And this is happening consistently. People had regular fasts that they would do during their week, once, sometimes twice a week. But they would also be fasts for special occasions. It could be an event on the calendar or a special realization of the sin that's in their life that they're fasting in response to. People would fast as individuals, or times where the whole nation of Israel would fast together. Whole churches fasted together. And yet in this overwhelming amount of stories of fasting in the Bible, it is never from things. It's always from food. Rare occasions where it's food and water, but fasting in the Bible is when God's people intentionally do not eat. Now I know there's a trend to fast from something. And so often the language of it goes, hey, this thing has been taking a big part of my life, and so I'm going to put it on pause for a little bit so that I can more clearly respond to and follow God. Now, I'm so grateful that people can realize that and admit to it and take steps to address it, but it's not fasting. See, one of the reasons for that is whenever we have something that's taken a bigger place in our life than God is, that's just called sin. And we don't need a pause from sin or a break from it. We need to flee from sin. I mean, imagine doing this with someone who overindulges in alcohol. Like, hey, just take a month off of being drunk every night. Like maybe as a starting point, but the end goal is never a break or a pause. It's its removal. I mean, disagree with me on this point if you want. It's not a hill that I'm willing to die on, but I am willing to die on the hill of being pedantic about language. We fast from food. We abstain from other things. The word we're looking for is abstain. There's another trend as well in the modern church of fasting from something, not because it's sinful or wrong, but actually the opposite. It's something that brings us joy, that we can unsinfully delight in something, so we fast from it for God. Two issues here. One, again, that's abstain. But two, why? Like, why is it that we think that our joy and God's presence are mutually exclusive? Like, we can only relate to him if we're miserable. I just don't get it. No, fasting is when God's people intentionally do not eat. We give up what we need in our bodies because we recognize that we have a greater need, that we have a need for God that surpasses even what we physically require. And so we give up these things in a way that we feel it. We feel it in our whole body. Our body reminds us something's different. We're missing something in this. And we start to get hungry, and our stomach grumbles. We get grumpy in this time. But we give up what our bodies require in the acknowledgement that we have a greater requirement, which is God in our life. Now, fasting is something that shows up in just about every religion and just about every people group. And yet, biblical fasting is radically different. And that becomes clear when we look at what are people fasting for. I mean, take probably the most famous faster, Gandhi and his hunger strike. He was fasting, he was doing this to assert what he wants. And what he wanted was the fair and just treatment of people in his country. Or take the fastest growing group of fasters this day. People who do it intermittently as part of their diet. And why are they fasting? Well, to show off those sweet, sweet gains. Just to have these dramatic before and after pictures of them asserting, I want to lose weight, so I'm fasting. But biblical fasting is radically different. It is not about me asserting my way, me trying to get what I want, me trying to achieve anything. Fasting is a time that we remind ourselves of the greater need than we have, even of food, which is God's presence. And as we do so, it comes with the assurity that God is present with us always. We strip out what we need for life, especially in these times of difficulty, so that we can more clearly see God. When all else confuses or gets in the way or obscures our vision of God, we fast, we strip away what's required so that we can more clearly see Him. Now, when I first became a Christian, I thought fasting was a way to supercharge prayer. Like, I want God to do something, and so I prayed about it. But if I really want Him to take attention, if I really want Him to do what I want, I can add fasting to it. Look how serious I am, God. But fasting is not about me getting my way. It is about me being changed. Changed to see more clearly God is present. Changed to see more clearly that I need Him more than anything else, especially in these times of difficulty. Fasting, then, is a response. It's a response to just about every trace of brokenness in the Bible, to just about every trace of brokenness in our lives. It's a practice that forms us over time as it awakens our appetite for God, our need for Him more than anything else, especially as we experience the distaste of pain and suffering in this world. I mean, think of Jesus in Matthew chapter 9. He says, when He goes away, His people will fast. Because this place that we are in right now, it is a time that's full of hardship, it's full of brokenness and suffering. There's so much that tempts and traps us. So we fast as a way to focus in the midst of all that on our greatest need, which is God. And we respond to the difficulties of this world by fasting. There's an article on the Gospel Coalition that I thought captures this idea of fasting as a response so well. It speaks through these different categories as examples of what we might fast during, what we might fast in response to. The author wrote, so we fast because of our sin and the toll that it takes on others. We fast because as long as we're breathing, our sanctification is not yet complete. We fast because natural disasters ravage the world. We fast because people die of starvation and thirst, lacking the necessities of life. We fast when cancer tears through our bodies or those of our loved ones. We fast because the entire cosmos is groaning for redemption. We fast because Christ has not yet completed the work that He began in a manger. See, as long as there is difficulty in this world, as long as there's brokenness in our lives, we respond to that by fasting. But what does the Bible speak about even more so than fasting? Now again, we said it's all over. Like the Bible is clear, God's people fast. But what do they do even more so than fasting? Well, they feast. I think of Leviticus chapter 23, which is this list that God gives to the Israelites of all the feasts that He is commanding them to keep. It starts by the Sabbath, this weekly event that they were to have in their life. And then it's the Passover, which was often called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There's the Feast of First Fruits, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, which is interesting. It starts as a fast, people responding to the sin that's in their life, but ends as a feast in the celebration and assurance that God forgives sin. And then finally, there is the Feast of Booths. So 6 annual feasts that they were to keep, and one that was to happen every single week. And we still think God doesn't care about the joy of his people. He commanded them to feast, and feast often. And this idea continues with Jesus. Matthew chapter 9, the disciples of John come up and say, "Why aren't your disciples fasting?" Because it's evident to them that they see in Jesus and his followers a tendency to feast more than fast. And Jesus says, that's because something new is happening. That's because I am here. That's because this is a time of celebration. It is the time to feast. And elsewhere in the Bible, Jesus is accused of being a glutton and a drunkard. I mean, that's obviously not true, but there's a little fire to that smoke. Because he's always at food, he's always having meals with people. He's constantly having feasts. And that is because feasting is a spiritual practice. Again, we are made body and soul. And so what is good for the body nourishes the soul. But where fasting is a time of remembrance, a time of responding to all that's broken in this world, feasting is a remembrance. Feasting is a time that remembers that everything that we have comes from God. Every good gift comes from above. And so we delight in God's provision. We delight in God by feasting. Now, there's the obvious time that this shows up in our life. There's events on the calendar, which are feasts on a large scale that we get to experience this together. But remember, in that list that God gave in Leviticus chapter 23, there's also Sabbath. Sabbath was seen as a weekly feast. It's not just something that we have occasionally. God calls for his people to regularly feast. Now, I don't know about you, but there's plenty of times in my life that I include like little treats, like little moments of joy throughout my week. One of the things that we look forward to as a family is every Saturday we get breakfast burritos. And I do look forward to it. It's on the calendar. I'm looking forward to Saturday we're going to eat breakfast burritos. Or there's times when we're going to go out to a new restaurant and I put it on my calendar. And then every time that I have my calendar open, I see it. Oh, we're going Friday or we're going Saturday. And it builds this excitement, this anticipation. I'm going to eat something delicious or something new. Or I'm out running errands and it's a drag. And so, I'm already out and about. So why not just get a little something for me? And I'll pick up cold brew or a boba. There's these little moments of joy in our life, and they can be so good and so nourishing when we don't cut God out of that process. See, as we feast in what is abundant or excellent or both, we do so understanding that God has given us all, and we delight ourselves in God's provision to us. But we also don't cut others out of the process either. That feasting is a time for us to be generous to other people, to be inclusive as we invite and pull other people into our life. That one of the things that's warned about with feasting is overindulgence. And a great way to avoid that is by having other people to share this food with. But as we do so, as we gather together in feasting and we're celebrating what God has given to us, we do so with an eye towards the greatest feast. That's not a coincidence that all of human history is culminated as we are joined together, finally seeing Jesus face to face at a feast. Feasting and fasting are intertwined. And not just because they're both about food, but they are kind of two sides of the same coin. They're the regular rhythm of what Christian life looks like in this time. And the joy and the difficulty, the good and the bad, and the times of waiting and the times of rejoicing. But it also is the way that we prepare for feasting is by fasting. And I mean that both figuratively and literally. That we better experience the joy in feasting as we recall the difficulty God has guided us through when we were fasting. And then literally, we prepare best to eat a feast when we aren't snacking throughout the day. I mean, how often do we want to eat a big dinner when we have just been constantly eating all day long? But feasting and fasting are intertwined in Matthew chapter 9 as well. Jesus says, when I go, then my people will fast. And that's the place that we are in right now. We are waiting for Jesus to return. And so we spend our time now fasting. And this is a practice that forms us. It shapes us to be more like him in our waiting. But we also know that Jesus is not fully removed. He's not gone. He's not aloof, unaware of what's going on in our life. He's active. He's present. He is the one truly working to form us to be more like him. And we know he's coming back. And he's coming back at a feast that is unrivaled by all else. So we prepare now by feasting, that we spend our time being shaped and formed by this practice of feasting as we celebrate that God has given us all that we have. And so why should we do these? Why should Christians now be fasting and feasting? Now, I hope so far in our time that we've seen some reasons why they should be a practice for us, but let me specifically spell out 3 reasons why we should fast and feast. 1, the Bible commands us to. I mean, even just in our passage, Matthew chapter 9, Jesus says, when I am gone, then my people will fast. This command to do so. We could go to any number of places where God's people are called to fast and to feast. And we don't even have to leave the words of Jesus to get to that point. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 and 18, it says twice there, when you fast. I want to draw our attention to that first word, when. It's not if, when you fast. See, there's no optional route here. There's no plan B. Jesus is saying, when my disciples fast, when my followers fast, because it is a given that they will be doing so. And the same thing is said in Luke chapter 14 about feasting. And I do mean literally the same thing is said about feasting in Luke chapter 14. It says here, when you give a dinner or a banquet, and then in the very next verse, when you give a feast. See, Jesus isn't giving instruction on what his followers might do. He's telling his followers what to do. And that includes fasting and feasting. Second reason why we do these things is because Jesus did. In Matthew chapter 4 and its parallels, Jesus is in the wilderness fasting for 40 days, remaining faithful where Israel was not in the Old Testament. And then, as we said, his entire ministry is centered around food. He is constantly at meals. He is frequently celebrating feasts. He's even accused of liking feasts too much. As this whole series about how we are formed to be more and more like Jesus, well, what's Jesus like? Well, he spent his time feasting and fasting. So if we're to be like him, we're going to do the same. And it gets to the third point. The third reason why we do these things is because we're formed by them. That by fasting and feasting, we are shaped and formed slowly over time to be more and more like Jesus. That as we do so, in the responding to the brokenness of this world, and remembering God and his presence and provision in our life, by fasting and feasting, these are 2 practices that shape us to live in the way God's called us to live. And that's why these 2 practices have been hallmarks for the Christian church throughout church history. In fact, as you look throughout church history, there's one group that's not overall marked by a habit of fasting, and that's the American church over the last 100 years or so. One of the ways that we say that we can use church history is that if we ever find ourselves alone or with a novel belief or practice, after 2,000 years of God faithfully guiding and protecting and caring for his church, if we're ever on this side and we have some sort of new and novel thing, we should really, really reevaluate because we're doing something wrong. And so how do we do this? How do we fast and we feast in our lives today? I want to be really practical with this. I want to be as clear as I can about how we can practically do these 2 habits. Now, not like that's going to make these easier. They're difficult. They're hard to do. It's hard to fast when things are hard. It's hard to remember to do that. That's not our instinct. And it's difficult to remember God is our provider when we have a bounty of food in front of us. Both of these are difficult for us to do. And so in giving these practical steps, I'm never going to make this easy for us. It's going to continue to be a challenge. But that's why we need these practices, because they form us and shape us. So I want to at least give us a starting point on how we can do these two things. And I'll take fasting first. Again, there's two parts to fasting. Fasting as a regular habit and fasting in response to specific events. And these two are intertwined together. They're supposed to work together. We don't have the instinct to fast in response to difficulty, whether it's a natural disaster or tragedy strikes our community. We don't have that instinct to fast in these times if we aren't building this as a regular habit throughout our weeks. Now, it's not as though we just fast now because you got to get ready for the next disaster. How great is that? But there's plenty within our week that we can respond to with fasting. There's plenty of brokenness at home in ourselves that we can respond to in fasting. And so we do these two things. We fast regularly, and we fast when tragedy or difficulty strikes, as this is part of the rhythm of responding to God, realizing his presence and our need for him all the more. And so let me give a couple ideas about how this can be a regular habit for us. Maybe this starts with just one meal. Sometime this upcoming week, I'm going to fast from a meal. Sometime where I'm going to cut out a time that I would otherwise be eating to remind myself of this greater need that I have. And then see if this could be replicable. Next week, can you do the same thing? Or sometime later on to create this as a regular habit in your life. And as you're doing so, this is going to be a new practice for some, and so you need to take care of yourself in this. Experiment to see when is the best meal to do this in your week to where you can still function, but get this time to remind yourself of God's presence. Drink lots of water. Maybe as you're starting out, it's not removing calories entirely, but as you're removing the meal, replace it with a juice or something so that this can be a healthy and sustainable practice for you. Or it could be starting with a day. One 24-hour period where we are fasting from food in the recognition of what our greatest need is. And let me give an example of what I did in this past week. Now, wait a second. We just read Matthew chapter 6. And Jesus says, when you're fasting, don't draw attention to yourself. Don't make it look like you're fasting. And so me sharing anything that I did completely undoes any spiritual good that comes from fasting. I'm really grateful that I get a chance to say that there's so much more on fasting that I would like to share. I just don't have the time to do so. I had a whole what about section. What about Daniel, or what about this and that, as what I wanted to address in this, and I just don't have the time to do it. But I do want to speak to this point because I find it so important. Jesus is speaking against drawing attention to yourself in fasting when we assume that it's coming from a place of pride or that we're earning something from God or from others. That is what he's speaking against in there. And I hope I've been very clear on this point. That's not what we're doing when we're fasting. Fasting is a response. It is a response to God and the circumstances of our life. And I want to be as clear on this as possible. I am no good at fasting. It is not something that I excel at. In fact, I got into this topic. I chose this topic because it's been such a neglected part of my life. And I was hoping that in this study that I would first discover why I should be doing this in my life and then have a chance to share that with all of you to see if there's something similar for us here. Now, I know, as I've said, there's people here who have been regularly fasting, and you could probably share so much with me of what's been helpful for you, of how this has been a shaping time for your life, how you've been formed to be more like Jesus. You're much better at this than I am. And this is why we should be sharing what we're doing when we're fasting. We should be talking about it. We should be fasting together. It's a way for us to hold each other accountable, to strengthen each other, to be a source of encouragement when we are calorie deficient and we need encouragement. And we can do so. We can talk about what we're doing in fasting and still keep Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 6 when we recognize that this isn't coming from a place of pride or earning for us. All that said, let me share what I did in this past week. I have a little schedule that we're throwing up right now, and there's nothing special about it. You can find better ones. You'll probably find better ones from people sitting next to you, but this is just what I did as a simple way of beginning this practice, which is a place for many of us in here of beginning this practice. I went dinner to dinner One 24-hour period. I ate dinner Thursday night, and I did not eat again until Friday night. Now, the difficulty of taking this one message and going on rotation, I have to do this 3 weeks in a row, forcing me to make this a habit. So I'm not lying to you all, but this is what I did in this past week. And in those times that I would otherwise be eating, my body is reminding me, hey, you're used to feeding me right now. And I feel that. My stomach is grumbling, and I use those reminders to remind me of what my greater need is. And so I prayed during what would normally be meal times. And even then, my prompts were specific because I wanted something to work through. I needed something to take my attention. I was hungry, and so I wanted something that would take my focus. But they're still fairly basic points. I would first look to God. I would look to others. And then I would look to life, to my own life. So look up, look out, look in, and I would do that first at breakfast, then lunch, then dinner. And then I celebrated the ending point of this by feasting with Emily on Friday night. Now, it might not work for you to feast immediately after a fast. That's really hard on your body. It might be smarter to break your fast with something small, like a smoothie. But I was very hungry and very excited for 24 hours to be up, so I was excited to feast. I also did this on my day off. Fridays are my day off, and I would love to move this towards a work day during a weekday, but I'm still getting used to this, and I have a propensity to be hangry, and I don't want to do that to the people that I supervise at the office. That doesn't seem like a great fit. So I moved it to my day off, but fasting and Sabbath are different things. Sabbath is a feast, and so I want to eventually get to the point that I'm comfortable in moving this to a different day. Now, all of this is not to show, hey, this is what you have to do. It's not to create a rigid system for you. It's hopefully showing something that this is what I've been trying. I've been seeing it beneficial to focus on what my greatest need is when I'm hungry. This is what I think is a sustainable practice for after I'm done preaching this message to 3 campuses, that it can still be part of my life as it's a way for me to be formed and shaped, recognizing that God is present in my life and he is a greater need than all else. And we can do something similar with feasting. Again, 2 parts to this and what God has given us. There's the weekly habit of rejoicing in God, and there's the there's the events that we have that are on the calendar that are a more intensified version of feasting. And so for that regular aspect, we as a family try to have something that delights us in our week. That this can be a time that we remember God is present with us, he's active in our life, he's doing good even when we don't always recognize it. So we have one thing at least that delights us in our week as a way to remind ourselves to feast in that God has given us all that we have. But there's also times on our calendar that we do this on a larger scale. Our life group, we get together and we do potlucks on occasion. And it's this understanding that we've gone through difficulty together, that we've had plenty that we have rejoiced over. And so we are people brought together by God in this group. And so we come together and everyone contributes to this meal. And we have it as a time for us to rejoice in what God has done. And God has done in our group and anticipation as to what he might do next. Every year, Emily and I try to have the best meal that we have all year on New Year's Eve. We save up for it and we feast on that night. And we look back on the year that was, and we look ahead to what God might do in the next. It's a time for us to see how has God provided in anticipation of him continuing to provide in our life as well. Now, I do want to end with a word of warning, that food can have an outsized place in our life, either in the avoidance of it or the indulgence of it. See, for some, food is acting as an idol. It's a primary place of comfort for us. And we find it hard to stop eating when things are hard. Or we find it hard to stop eating when things are good. And so we should be cautious when feasting. All the more reason to be gathered around by people who know us and care about us, to be a help in times that we are delighting ourselves into what God has given to us. On the other side, there are people who physically cannot fast. Be that to blood sugar levels or another medical need. Or for some, it's the reminder and the temptation to a time in our life or a struggle that we have to not fast from food for religious purposes, but for body image purposes. For other people, like Emily, I shared that she feasted with me on Friday, but she did not fast during the week because she's currently a food source for a tiny person. And so whatever it is, there are plenty of reasons why there are lifetime inability to fast or seasons of life where we cannot. And yet I still think that there is a way that we can get to the heart of what fasting is centered around meal times. That even when we cannot give up food, I think there is a way for us to participate in fasting when we wish that we could. And this could be a day in our week that we set aside. This is when I would be fasting otherwise. Or there's people in our lives that are fasting on this day and we're together with them. And I think it starts with directing our mind towards God at mealtimes, similar as if we were fasting. It starts with just a simple guided prayer of, God, I cannot give this up. Help me still to see that I'm more dependent on you than this food here. And while we don't have hunger reminding us of this being our focus in this time, I think we can be intentional with our action, be purposeful in what we're doing. We make this meal physically different somehow. I'm not at my desk. My computer is off. My phone is away from me. God, while I cannot use my forgoing of food to remind me of your presence in meal times, I'm using my actions to set this time apart differently. All for the reminder of your presence is with me. My need for you is greater even than this meal I'm dependent on. You are in my life, providing all that I have. Now, with this, and I want to be clear that this is not me giving medical advice. Please don't ever come to me for medical advice. I don't know. But this is my encouragement, my prodding where it's medically appropriate. Let's not confuse something that's difficult as impossible. Fasting and feasting are hard to do. They don't always come instinctual to us, or when we are feasting, we just look at the food that's in front of us, and we don't often see the provider that's behind us. But that's all the more why we need these two practices. Because it's in doing them that we are shaped, that we're formed. And being shaped hurts. It's hard. It's us being stretched and pulled in ways that are uncomfortable for us to look more and more like Jesus. It's difficult to do this. And we're reminded of that every time our stomach grumbles, and we miss it every meal that we take for granted. And these two practices are ways that are shaping for us, forming for us to become more and more like Jesus. Now, like the other practices that we are talking about in this series, things aren't going to change overnight for us. In fact, with fasting and feasting, it's probably going to be slower than the others. We can't often do it in seasons of life. We can't just do makeup work to look over the neglect of times that we've had this in our past. Too much feasting, that's called gluttony. Too much fasting, that's starvation, and there's bad results that come from that. And yet slowly, over time, as these practices become instinctual for us, they are ways that shape us and form us to be more like Jesus in the times of difficulty and the times of good. That they begin to help us to understand and have a clear picture on how we understand God, our bodies, what God is doing in this world, and the difficulty that we navigate within. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And the way that we prepare for that first part, that trouble, and the way that we rejoice in that second part, that he has overcome, is as we spend our days now marked by fasting and feasting. Let me pray for us. Father, it is a joy to be here on the Boulder campus, to be surrounded by people who seek to know you and love you more, who have heard your teaching for many years now, or have been hearing your teaching recently on how you are guiding them, shaping them. In response to what you've done, to your saving, we want to live lives that are shaped and formed to look more and more like your Son. And we do this not to earn or to get anything from you, but in light of your all-sufficient work, we want to live lives in response to you. And these lives include fasting and feasting. That you've given us the practice of fasting to respond to the difficulty and brokenness and sin in this world. And you've given us the gift of feasting to remember everything that we have from you as a gift. So as we spend our days now doing these two practices, let them be tools that are used, let them be tools that are habits for us to shape us to become more and more like your Son. So it's you and you alone that we pray.